Not seeing anybody else, but I'll just keep an eye on the. Just making sure everybody's admitted. Yeah. There we go. Okay. So I think that's nearly everyone now. We'll just keep an eye on admit as they pop up on the screen. And just to say hello and welcome to everyone. We are now recording this, and I'll still have a few. If I can just remind folk to just keep your microphones muted for the time being until we get to asking some questions, or unless you're presenting, obviously. And just to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. Welcome to this, which is the third in a series of workshops on around the general theme of woodland creation. And these are supported, I should say, by Safari and also by the Scottish Funding Council's University Innovation Fund. For those of you who don't know me, we can see your email, Pat. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Rob McMorrin. I'm a researcher at the Rural Policy Centre in Scotland's Rural College, normally undertaking research but also teaching around the themes of land use, land reform and rural development. Just a little bit of housekeeping. As I mentioned, just please keep your microphones off when I'm speaking. We suggest when it gets to the questions and discussion stage, just use the hand raise function, which is just in the top right hand corner to participate. Or if you can't find that, just raise your actual hand or just turn on your camera and shout at us if all of those fail, and we will try and get to you. You can also post comments and questions in the chat function. And there is one or two people that are helping me out there, keeping an eye on that if I do miss any of their comments. But also, I should say, if anybody else wants to respond to a question or a comment in the chat function, by all means, please do that. Don't just rely on us to respond. If you feel it's an open question and you'd like to comment on that, please do. Like I say, we are recording this now for anyone that's just joining. And somebody just saying that there's silence there and there. I presume folk can hear me because nobody else has said it's silent. I'm pretty sure you can't hear me. So I think that might just be a microphone or speaker functionality issue for that person. So like I said, this is the third in a series of workshops, which really are the result, or I suppose the final stage of a Safari Fellowship, which I undertook with Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park last year. And at the time, the idea was to engage the landowners, the forest managers and what have you in the park. Of course, we ended up doing it all online because of the pandemic, but that didn't stop us achieving a pretty good level of engagement across the owners, managers, consultants, and I should say thank you to everyone that took part in that. I have shared the links to the outcomes, the outputs from that report and the summary report in the email that I sent around yesterday. And also, just to say as well that I have posted a few links in the chat function, just around various bits and pieces of information and other relevant events like the Farm Advisory Service events, Farming for a Better Climate, also Soil Association events, and also I've put up a link to Future Woodlands Scotland. And so now or later on, whenever you get a chance, you want to have a look at some of those, you might find them informative. In terms of what this is about, really, I guess it's a response to some of the findings from that work that I mentioned, the Safari Fellowship, which related to one of the recommendations, which was a call for greater awareness and dissemination of information relating to various themes. One of those was woodland carbon, and so that's essentially why I undertook to sort of organise this event today. And as I'm sure you know, there's quite a lot of interest in and around sort of woodland carbon generally, and whether land managers, landowners, farmers, what have you, can generate income from this area. But there's also potentially some sort of gaps in knowledge and information out there. So this is partly just about addressing some of that. So there's 3 speakers. I don't want to carry on anymore. It's not about hearing from me today, it's about hearing from the speakers. So I just want to say thanks initially to everybody that is participating today, but particularly to the speakers for taking the time to contribute. And maybe just stop at that point and ask the 3 folk that are speaking today to maybe just say briefly who you are and where you've come from today. Maybe start with you, Pat, seeing as your presentation is up. Pat's up first, but maybe just to say hello, Pat, and where you're from.
Yep. Hello, everybody. I'm Pat Snowden. I work for Scottish Forestry, and I'm head of the Economics and Woodland Carbon Code team. And I'll talk to you a bit more about that in just a minute.
And Fiona, you'd like to say anything?
Hi, everyone. I'm Fiona Chalmers. I'm a brand manager for Future Woodland Scotland. And as Pat said, I'll be telling you more about that shortly.
Thanks, Fiona. And finally, Claire, you want to say hello to folk?
Yeah, so I'm Claire Whiteman. I'm a forestry consultant, work for Tree Story, which is a relatively young forestry consultancy, been going for the past sort of 3 years-ish.
Perfect. Thanks, Claire. So I think no need to really hear anything more from me. So I'll pass you back to Pat, who's going to talk to us about the woodland carbon code in particular, and also natural capital values from forestry. And just a reminder to keep your microphones off for the time being, and I will mute myself. Over to you, Pat.
Thanks, Rob. And Rob's asked me to talk for about 15 minutes, so I'll be quite brief. Some of the slides I won't really be able to go into detail, but I'll sort of pick out some of the key points. So I'll briefly talk about what the Woodland Carbon Code is, and then say a bit about wider natural capital values from forestry with using a specific case study. Some of you may be familiar with the code, but it was launched 11 years ago. It's a UK-wide carbon standard for woodland creation projects only to date. And the whole point of it is to build trust in the woodland carbon market. You know, without these types of standards, it's unlikely that businesses will want to invest in woodland creation to generate carbon credits, because they would feel it would be too risky for their reputations if there wasn't confidence that there are standards in place to provide assurance that the credits will actually be delivered. And we follow best practice in some of the leading global standards, and we are endorsed by the international body ECROA, which is quite important actually, because the wider carbon market does follow a lot what ECROA says. It's taken us 10 years. I won't dwell on this slide, but the point is it's not an overnight job to set one of these things up. And also, once you have launched a scheme, it needs to continue to evolve, which you can see the code has done over the past 10 years. The main requirements of any code really are that any carbon code, the essential things with nature-based solutions, you need good science. In the forestry case, the UK forestry standard is important as well, because those are the government's guidelines on how to manage forests sustainably. But for nature-based solutions, you need robust science. We have the benefit of Forest Research carbon growth, tree growth models on which the carbon models are based, and they've been developed over a number of decades and are used in the UK's greenhouse gas inventory. And then above that, any good standard will have clear rules around additionality, permanence, and transparency, the third bullet from the bottom, and independent validation and verification. Those are the real key issues. Additionality is quite a topic in itself. I won't go into it in detail right now, but the basic idea behind it is that you need to be able to show that the reason the project is going ahead is because of the carbon. And the most common way to do that is through an investment test, which shows that the carbon finance that comes into the project is the thing that makes it viable. In other words, if a project was viable with other sources of finance, then it would fail the additionality test and it wouldn't be validated under the code. And the whole point about additionality is that it's trying to provide confidence that actually actions in the carbon market are driving real change, not just supporting business as usual, because it's that change that you need to actually achieve climate change targets. Permanence is really important for forestry, that we can assure the market that there won't be reversals. And we have mechanisms in place to do that. And also under law, forestry is a permanent change in land use in the UK. And on transparency, we have a carbon registry which tracks every single credit and prevents double counting. And that is run by IHS Markit, who are based in New York. You can see there's about 300 projects across the UK that have been validated to date. 94 of these have actually been verified at year 5. That's the verifications are the periodic checks that are undertaken on projects through their lifetime. And it's at verification that you get actual verified credits which companies can use as offsets. And you can see there there's a large number of projects in the pipeline. We've had a huge surge in interest in the last 18 months to 2 years since the net zero targets have been announced. Types of projects, they obviously new woodlands. Most woodland carbon code schemes have been predominantly native mixed woodland, and they deliver a wide range of benefits. And one of the advantages of the woodland code is its ability to deliver those wider benefits, which a lot of companies find attractive, because they may be looking for carbon as offsets, but they also like being able to talk about the benefits for local communities and wildlife, etc. This is an example of a scheme in Wales. I could have picked any number of examples, but you can see there, this case, it's ex-grazing land that's been planted. It has some wider wildlife benefits in terms of connecting up different protected areas. And you can see that a local company, Thorlux Lighting, wanted to use it to offset its emissions. There's reference there to a buffer. That's part of our permanence arrangements, that 20% of all credits have to be put into a buffer, which projects are not allowed to use. The buffer's there to protect against future losses if anything happens to the woodland. And on the buyer side, so could everybody mute? I can hear somebody's microphone's on. Thank you. On the buyer side, you can see that some of the reasons why companies get involved in woodland carbon code schemes. Waitrose being one of the companies, but we have had roughly 500 companies involved now. Quickly on the carbon accounting side, when you plant a woodland, you don't have anything at that stage. You just have some seedlings. You don't really have any carbon. So we do have to estimate the amount of carbon that the woodland will generate in the future, and we use the Forest Research carbon models to do that. And that will come up with an estimate of what we call pending issuance units. They are basically the promise to deliver the amount of carbon that will be sequestered by the woodland in its lifetime. And then as the trees grow and you go through these periodic verifications, you then convert these pending issuance units to what we call woodland carbon units, which are verified units, and they can be used by companies as offsets. Companies cannot use pending issuance units as offsets because technically the carbon doesn't exist at that point. All negotiations are over the counter between farmers, say, and buyers, or very often through intermediaries, people like Forest Carbon, who you may be familiar with. And they're over the counter negotiations. There's no sort of clearing market price or anything like that at the moment. There is a question about price differentiation. Are WCUs worth more than PIUs? The answer is probably yes, but we haven't been able to systematically assess that because we're not really privy to the price data. It's a private matter between the buyers and the sellers. And then the final point they know about charismatic carbon. This refers to, some people call it charismatic carbon. It's the wider benefits of these projects. And there is an issue which is arising out of that as to whether we should have sort of bundled benefits, which we do under the Woodland Carbon Code. Any wider benefits are bundled into the carbon credit, or whether in the future we might look at stacking credits, different types of credits, so carbon, water, biodiversity, etc. And that's an ongoing discussion. We are looking at greater price transparency in the future, whether we could actually systematically collect price data and even potentially move to a trading platform in the future. As I said, you can only have ex post reporting of credits, so you can only use verified credits, not PIUs. And all credits are recorded on the IHS market registry. And once a credit is allocated or sold to a buyer, it cannot be reclaimed by the landowner to be sold to somebody else or used by somebody else. There is currently an issue about corresponding adjustments. this is a rather sort of in-depth issue which is being discussed internationally, which we can pick up in questions if you wish, but it's to do with the role of voluntary carbon markets and whether governments can actually use credits from voluntary markets, record them on their greenhouse gas inventories. We think they should, because obviously it's a key incentive then for people to use the Woodland Carbon Code to help meet our climate change targets. Cost of certification, validations will typically cost around £750 a project. You can have group projects where they group together, and it could be roughly 40% savings per project if they do that. They need to pay a levy on each carbon unit that is validated. And at verification, they also have to pay a 3p levy to convert PIUs into WCUs. And verification, you can see the costs there. It's more costly at a 5-year verification because there's a site visit. We're looking at whether techniques like remote sensing might be able to reduce verification costs in future. And the potential income, well, that really does depend on the carbon price, obviously. But you can see some rough figures there for a typical native broadleaf woodland, say over a 50-year period. And some of this has been summarised here. I should probably update this slide because £5 a tonne is really at the lower end these days. We're frequently seeing prices closer to £20 a tonne of carbon at the moment. Just to say something quickly about wider natural capital values. The whole natural capital approach is something that we've looked at in a lot more detail in recent years. And I'm actually going to a meeting tomorrow in the Borders at Larriston, the Woodland Creation Project there, where quite a detailed natural capital assessment was done. And I'll just talk briefly about those in the ensuing slides. But the point about looking at things from a natural capital perspective is that you don't just think about what are the impacts on the environment, whether they're good or bad, but you think also about what are the dependencies that businesses have on the environment. And if we're going to get, behaviour change in climate change or anything else, this issue of dependency is really important. And a much larger number of businesses now are waking up to their dependencies on biodiversity and nature, basically. And you can see there that the natural capital approach provides a broader perspective on looking at these issues rather than the more sort of narrow, limited way in which we've looked at it in the past. This site at Larriston is roughly 500 hectares of woodland planting. The actual whole site is quite a lot larger than that. It includes extensive areas of moorland, and it's a productive woodland. It's got various bits of others. It's got a mixture of species. Having said that, for various reasons, it went through local community consultation processes. But it has a productive focus at its heart. And what the project did was to use what's called the Natural Capital Protocol, which is a framework for businesses to look at their impacts and dependencies on nature. The Natural Capital Protocol is a global initiative. It's based largely in London, but it's seen as a big step forward in how businesses view the environment. And we use various methods to try and get at the values, natural capital values of the forestation project at Larriston, which you can see there. And it's interesting to note that the carbon comes out as a higher value than the timber. Now that's in a sense that's a notional value because the timber is a real market value, whereas the carbon sequestration is not the value in the markets of the carbon. This project wasn't a Woodland Carbon Code project, but even if it was and the carbon was being sold, it wouldn't have sold for that level of income because the government values a tonne of carbon at over £60 a tonne at the moment, which is way in excess of what we're achieving in the market. And there are good reasons for that, and the government should value carbon highly. It's just that the market hasn't yet really caught up. Some insights from the project, when we were looking at environmental impact assessments, we feel that a natural capital approach could provide a really useful perspective in the future in the planning and design of future woodlands, and understanding what the impacts of different woodland strategies are. And also, this type of assessment can be a useful way for engaging with stakeholders and local communities about the benefits of particular projects. It's also really important, and this is where, you know, the commercial forestry sector has an interest as well, to make the case for woodland creation, because a lot of investors want to know that they're not just investing in timber, they're actually doing something that's good for the planet. And this type of natural capital assessment can provide that evidence. And it informs the feasibility also of developing payments for ecosystem services. And you know, people are talking about future markets in biodiversity and water quality, etc. The more sort of natural capital evidence we can generate to support this type of thing, the better. It goes back to the first point I made with the Woodland Carbon Code about having robust science to actually demonstrate the benefits that forestry provides. That was just a sort of infographic which summarizes the project. So I'm happy to put a link to it in the chat if you wish, but it really just reiterates what I've just said. And that's me. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Pat. Well, I'll just take a minute now before we go to our next speaker, and I'll let Pat stop screen sharing, and Fiona's up next. But if anyone has any questions at this point, would anyone like to ask a specific question about the presentation? We'll just take a couple of minutes now just for one or two questions. We'll have more time for discussion at the end. Does anybody want to ask anything specific on that presentation first? Yeah, Tim, I can see your hand up. Might be other hand up too, I think.
Yeah, hi, I wrote it in the comments as well. Pat, you said there was a good reason why the government valued carbon at £60 a tonne, which wasn't the market rate. Just explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's about £65 at the moment, and that is seen as the carbon price that's necessary to meet the government's climate change targets. So it's a target-driven price. And whereas in the market, although prices have been going up, and that's a good thing, otherwise we'll never meet our climate change targets, they haven't caught up sufficiently yet. So, and there are predictions that prices will go up substantially further in the future. If you look at the emissions trading scheme, then prices of over £50 have already been achieved. But the Woodland Carbon Code operates in the voluntary market. There's no, you know, companies are not required to do it. So that may be one reason why prices are lower for us, but they're going in the right direction.
Okay. And would anyone else have any? Is there a second question for Pat on that? Or if not, I'll move on to our next speaker. No, I'm not seeing any hands there. I do have some questions as well, but I'm happy to wait till the end for that. So.
There are a couple of if you want.
Oh yeah, there is a couple in the chat, right? Okay, yeah, that was, it just came in quite low there for some reason. Yeah, I'm not sure why. Yeah, okay, yeah. Some we might come to at the end. So I'll just have a quick look at that. Yeah, Tim will address. Amanda asked, is it likely that the carbon sequestration value will have an impact on the cost of timber in future? Is carbon likely to impact on timber costs, Pat?
Well, it won't impact on the cost of harvesting timber or anything directly. Obviously, it has an impact on the overall economic viability of forestry schemes. But this is where additionality is important, because if schemes are viable with timber receipts alone, they will very likely fail the additionality tests of the Woodland Carbon Code, because arguably these schemes would have happened anyway. And what the code's trying to do is to enable projects to go ahead that wouldn't have gone ahead under normal conditions. So, and it's in those projects where it will make a real difference to their viability.
Yeah. And I suppose sort of relates to that. One last question from Andrew. In terms of existing woodland, so Andrew's asking in the chat, how do we prevent people from clearing existing woodland to plant new woodland and obtain carbon credits? Which is an unintended consequence.
Well, it would be illegal, would be the straight answer, because under the Forestry Act in England and the Forestry and Land Management Act in Scotland, woodland is a permanent change in land use, so you can't fell your woodland just like that. If you do, you'd be in breach of the law. If you want to fell a woodland, you need to apply for a felling license, and that's only given on condition that you replant the woodland. But if under the Woodland Carbon Code, if you're planting a woodland that you intend to fell, you can only claim about 1/3 of the amount of the carbon, because obviously you're taking most of that carbon out of the woodland. So it does put a brake on the quantity of carbon credits you can claim.
Okay. Okay, that's great. We can come back to some of that later anyway. Fiona, would you?
And I apologise that you can't see me. I'm obviously hiding in trees there somewhere. There's some quirk going on with my camera this afternoon.
So Fiona, would you like to screen share your presentation there? Fiona Chalmers is going to talk next on. Well, I'll let you.
Okay, thank you, Rob. So I'm just putting that on screen share now. Can you see it okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. Okay, so as said earlier, I'm the program manager for Future Woodland Scotland, and I'm not sure how many of you know about Future Woodland Scotland. We're quite a small charity, but quite a large beginning, if you like, with its origins in the Scottish Forestry Alliance, which began in the year 2000 with funding from BP, about £10 million funding. And this was a partnership between Forestry Land Scotland, the Woodland Trust and the RSPB. And the Scottish Forestry Alliance did an amazing amount of work over 10 years and created around about 5,000 hectares of new woodland. And of course, this was happening at the same time as the Woodland Carbon Code was being developed, as Pat said earlier. So there's quite a lot of work in terms of innovation there and quite a lot of research that fed into that. And so Future Woodland Scotland was the legacy charity that was looking at trying to encourage and continue innovative research. And since 2012, when it was established, there's been a programme of research on innovation. The charity was called Sustainable Forestry at that time and changed its name about 5 years ago. And then around 2 years ago, BP were very interested in looking at investing more in this kind of work. And out of that came the Future Woodlands Fund, supported by £2 million from BP. And this was launched in March this year. Now, the Future Woodlands Fund is very much a pilot programme looking at incentivising new native woodland creation, but also the trustees of Future Woodland Scotland were very keen on looking at how we can restore existing derelict woodlands, and I'll come on to that a little bit later on. Because of the connection with the carbon and because we didn't want to create something standalone, the whole aspect of the fund is designed to work alongside the Forestry Grant Scheme and the Woodland Carbon Code. And one of its key principles is to try and test what level of intervention incentive would be needed in order to reduce the barriers to woodland creation and restoration or conservation in Scotland. So the fund was really designed to look at how we're going to do that. And the things that we came up with were to provide a lot of advice and support as well as financial incentives. So we looked at creating a very easy application process online, and then we would work with applicants after that to develop up an outline plan. We would then cover the cost for professional forestry agents, whether it's an agent that the applicant's already working with, or we would tender for a new agent. Those costs would cover the full process needed for the Forestry Grant Scheme application, but also the Woodland Carbon Code project design document. And then the current offer gives an area payment of £100 per hectare per year for 20 years based on a 55-year agreement. And that current offer, it was based on how the Farm Woodland Premium Scheme worked, and it was looking a little bit towards income foregone and whether this was the thing that landowners and land managers would need to incentivise them to look at land use change. As I said, as I said a little while ago, this is a pilot scheme, and one of the beauties of this is that it's very reactive and responsive. And as Pat's already mentioned, there's been quite a lot happening in the last 2 years since the original study was done, looking at what was needed. So we did a review of the pilot in September, in the last few weeks. And one of the things that was really clear to us is that there are significant changes in the market. So we talked to some of our partners, the agents, and we came out with a few conclusions from that. Firstly, as we all know, this new carbon market is evolving and changing very rapidly. The price of carbon as a saleable commodity is increasing, and as Pat's already said, it's likely to continue to do so. And for that reason, and probably for reasons such as cross-compliance that may come in with future rural development grants, it's very likely that land managers are now going to want to retain ownership of carbon in the future. And then we looked at small schemes. They're likely to need more support, but they're less likely to benefit from the carbon market and less groups. So part of our review showed that, well, perhaps there are some differences here, and that we need to restructure what we're offering towards how the market is changing. So we have discussed that. The trustees agreed some of the changes at the development day in September, and then that was discussed with our Fundo VP, who incredibly supportive towards how can we provide what's needed for people to create more woodland. And so this is the offer, which is a change from what we've already got. This is going to be coming in the next couple of months. So we have the guaranteed income. So this is based on what we're already offering. So that's where we retain the ownership of the carbon. And in return for that, we will guarantee area payments. However, they are uplifted now to £175 a hectare for the 20 years. And the 20 years is designed to coincide with the 20-year contract for the forestry grant scheme. We also saw that small woodlands needed a little bit of extra help, particularly with the cash flow and the capital outlay that they need to do in order to do these schemes. So for those, we were looking and will look at front-loading area payments in order to help with cash flow. Now, the second thing, and this is the new area and the new option, which we hope will be attractive and incentivize land managers to plant more woodland, is where the land manager retains the ownership of the carbon. So again, for schemes over 5 hectare, we will support in the same way as described before. So we will provide the funding for an agent to do all that is required to come to a forestry grant scheme application and contract, and also all that is required to develop the Woodland Carbon Code project design document. And we will support those applications up to registration stage, and we will register the carbon in the name of the landowner land manager. For small woodland schemes, we will do the same thing, but we will also look to see how we can help them group in order that they can actually benefit more from the cost savings, as Pat had mentioned about being part of a group. Because with small schemes, the verification costs can become quite excessive and sometimes make it less viable. So in terms of eligibility, we're very much aligning this with the forestry grant scheme and the Woodland Carbon Code. So it needs to be a new scheme for us. It needs to be a native woodland. We're looking at schemes between 3 and 100 hectares. This has to be something that wouldn't otherwise happen. So in other words, it can't be a legal requirement to do it, and it must be eligible for the Woodland Carbon Code and the Forestry Grant Scheme. Now, we've got supplementary criteria because as time goes on, we want to be able to ensure that we are really encouraging high quality schemes. So if we are oversubscribed, because the pilot has a target has a financial target and has an area target and a carbon target. And if we are starting to get quite a lot of applications, we really want to look at good quality applications. So The other aspect that the trustees of Future Woodland Scotland were really keen on is how can we look at restoring some of the woodlands in Scotland that are really starting to degrade and decline. These we call ghost woodlands, and they're, as you can see in this picture here, they're relics, and they're usually ancient woodland. They're usually on the ancient woodland inventory, but they have high ecological value and unique communities, but they're in severe decline and under threat from usually overgrazing. And in most cases, they have less than 20% canopy cover. These are the ones that we're wanting to look at. And we're very keen to bring this in as a new option in the Future Woodlands Fund. And so for the last quite a few months now, we've been working with the team at the Woodland Carbon Code to develop a methodology that would show eligibility. In other words, that this is a non-woodland in terms of the eligibility criteria for the Woodland Carbon Code. And we're currently working with Scottish Forestry to establish a package of funding that would be us working alongside them with the Woodland Improvement Grant to be able to support conservation of projects like this. And we very much hope that this new option will add value to these kind of sites through carbon. And this is the key. You know, we're still working through a couple of case studies, so this one's not completely ready yet. We're very optimistic about it. But one of the fantastic things about this is how we can use carbon to incentivize positive management, because a woodland like this would suddenly have a lot more value if it is eligible in the carbon code. And of course, with woodlands like this, there would need to be advanced regeneration present. There would need to be a significant suppression of that regeneration through grazing in order for it to be eligible. But that's a lot of detail that we're working on. So this is just to let you know what we're hoping to be able to offer in the relaunch of the Future Woodlands Fund. So the way this would work for us is that we've been working with a digital map company looking at how you can identify sites. So we would see this as very much targeted approach, working with partner organizations, looking at map-based search. We would then approach land managers to talk to them about this and see if they're interested in working with us to draw up these applications to both the Forestry Grant Scheme and the Woodland Carbon Code. And then we would look at providing top-up funding to cover the actual capital costs. So this is the difference between what WIG, the Forestry Grant Scheme, currently offers and what the actual costs of the management that is necessary in order to bring this woodland into positive management. And as with the carbon ownership option for woodland creation, we would register the carbon in the landowner's name in order to incentivize that future positive management. And then we would agree a 20-year contract, again, in line with the Forestry Grant Scheme. This one, as I've just mentioned, we are still in the final stages of seeing how it works with the grant scheme. So it's not online yet, but we very much hope it will be online early next year. So if you're interested to know more, you can sign up to the Future Woodlands Fund newsletter on our website. If you have an application or you're thinking that you've got one after this presentation, you want to look at putting application in, we do have an online application process. You can submit it now, and then we will assess it when the options are launched early next year. So in other words, you're really registering an interest. It's a very simple form, but it tells us that you're interested in submitting an application, and when we're ready to launch the new offer, we'll be back in touch with you. And also just a little bit there about working with us. We're currently recruiting for a project manager. If anybody's interested in that, please have a look at our website. And also for any forestry agents that are out there, we really keen to work with agents. So what we want to do is develop relationships so that when we've got applications coming in, we've got a register of agents we can go to and ask to price for particular applications that have come in. So the website futurewoodlands.org.uk has quite a lot of information, and there's my email if anybody wanted to get in touch, or of course we can ask questions today. Hope that's okay. Shall I stop sharing it now, Rob?
Yeah, sure, you can stop sharing. That's brilliant. I think that's a really, really good overview, and covering quite a lot, and really interesting as well in relation to the fact that you're looking at how owners can retain some of their carbon or maybe work with other owners. I think is quite an interesting angle on it. And we've already got a question in the chat, and if anyone else has other questions as well, just stick your hand up, or if I don't see it or anything, please just shout it out, because I think that's fine. Andrew, please can Fiona explain a little more about how BP might use these carbon values? Will claims be made by BP in terms of offsetting fossil fuel use? It's a fair question about BP, I guess.
Okay, Andrew, maybe I didn't make that quite clear, but BP don't get the carbon from this now. So the landowner has the option to take the carbon. So the funding from BP, they're really interested in supporting creation of new native woodlands in Scotland. They're very interested in biodiversity and improving biodiversity. So they do not have any of the carbon values from this. Our contract is in the process of being updated to reflect that. And for the schemes where Future Woodland Scotland retain the carbon, then the charity will use that carbon income to reinvest in future woodlands, as the name suggests.
Yeah, okay. Clarification. And Simon, I can see you've got your hand up there. Do you want to shout out a question?
Thank you, Rob. A question for Fiona and Pat. I don't understand how many tons of carbon you might get out of either Fiona a ghost woodland or Pat a new native broadleaf plantation.
Do you want me to go first, or Pat, will you go first?
I'll go first if you like, and then hand over to Fiona. I mentioned the Forest Research tree growth models, and they model how quickly different species of tree grow over time, how much biomass they generate as a result, including in their roots and their branches, not just tree stem, for different species under different growing conditions. So each site you would assess using the ecological site classification tool. You would assess the growing conditions to see what yield class you might apply to your woodland. Yield class is a measure of how quickly the trees grow. And typically they follow an S-shaped curve, and for a coniferous woodland that might reach its maximum growth phase in, say, 20, 30 years. For some broadleaf woodlands, it would be 40, 50 years, even longer for an oak woodland or something. So that's the sort of growth profile over time, and that's what the Forest Research growth models would demonstrate. And we have carbon lookup tables on our website. I'll put a link in the chat in a minute, which allow projects to go in and put in their species, their management regime and everything, and it will churn out the predicted carbon numbers for them. The short answer is it's based on Forest Research models.
Fiona, do you want to come in there on ghost woodlands?
Sure. Yeah, so essentially it would use the same methodology, because those applications still have to fill in the Woodland Carbon Code project design document. However, ghost woodlands would be natural regeneration. So in order for them to be eligible, there has to be advanced regeneration present. And part of the methodology we've been working on will entail a tree regeneration survey of the site. So there'll need to be plot-based survey to determine the level of regen that's there. And then that would give an idea of what the potential sequestration might be if the factor that is preventing growth of the trees, i.e. sequestration, is taken away. So in other words, if the site is fenced. Now for natural regeneration, Pat may want to say more about this, but there's maximum yield class of 2 and 4, depending on the site. So the site that I showed you in that picture, the yield class is likely to be very low. It's the elevation's quite high. It's fairly poor soil, so that all of those calculations would be done as part of the project design document. But ghost woodlands are not going to be big carbon creators. They're not. But we hope that this will just add enough value to incentivize that management that stops this decline, as a lot of these woodlands are literally disappearing in our lifetimes.
Rob, if I could come back, what I don't understand is, I have no idea about this. So are we talking about sort of one ton of carbon a hectare for a ghost woodland and 1,000 tons of carbon a hectare for a flat piece of ground with lovely native plantation on it? It's the quantum. I understand there might be more science behind it, but just in quantum terms, could Fiona and Pat give a really rough average?
If you took perhaps a typical mixed native woodlands, you might be talking something like 400 tons over 50 years.
Right, thank you.
It will vary. That's actually what projects can actually use. In practice, it sequesters more than that, but we put substantial margins of error into our calculations. We take 20% off the estimates at the beginning, and then the further 20% goes into the buffer that I mentioned. Right. So that 400 really is only about 60% of the likely sequestration.
Okay.
And James has just posted a comment there. Sorry, Fiona, you can come in after me as well. James has just posted a comment to say the Woodland Trust is currently looking at comparisons between growth models and actual use of sites in the north of Scotland as well. Fiona, do you want to come back?
And sorry, on James's point, sorry, Fiona, the Forest Research have done similar work to actually, test the models over time and refine them, because we've got a lot of data now over decades of how quickly the trees have actually grown. Sorry, Fiona.
Oh, no worries. Well, I wish I could answer that question, but I can't at the moment because we're still doing the work on that. We do have a couple of case studies, one in the Highlands and one in Loch Arbour, and we've done full surveys on those. And over the next couple of months, we're going to be number crunching a lot of that data and seeing what are the likely carbon yields going to be. So this is sort of quite new for us. And we're working really closely with the Woodland Carbon Code and Scottish Forestry on this. So we'll have a better idea once we put those two case studies all the way through the process, and we'll actually do a project design document for them and a carbon calculation spreadsheet once we've actually looked at what the advanced regeneration is there, what density it is, and what are those other aspects, of the project design document. So at the moment, I can't answer it, but in a couple of months, I hope we will be able to answer that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. And there's just one other question there in the chat as well, which I think is probably for you, Fiona, but by all means come in as well, Pat. Does the woodland need to be contiguous? Does it need to be one big chunk, or can it be designed around existing farmland, so a bit of riparian on streams linking to larger blocks and things like that, i.e. a farm scale patchwork of woodland? Does that fit with your approach to your model?
Is that for, well, I mean, for the Future Woodland Fund, it has to be eligible for the forestry grant scheme. So we will be really looking at the criteria for that. So there's the minimum 15-meter strip. So, it really depends on the design of it, but we would work with the applicant and the woodland officer. We usually involve the woodland officer quite soon on to see what they would be happy to see in that design, but the bottom line is it needs to be eligible for the forestry grant scheme. Yeah.
Okay. So that's those criteria that you're using. Okay. So I think then we'll go on to hear from Claire, if that's okay with everybody at this point, and just to keep things moving along. And we'll have more time at the end. Who's going to talk about marketing carbon, a landowner's guide to implementing carbon projects. So over to you, Claire, if you want to take a shot at screen sharing. See how that goes for you.
Here we go. Is that all up and showing okay?
Perfect. Looks good to me. Yeah.
Perfect. Great. So hello again. So as I said at the beginning, I'm Claire Whiteman, work for Tree Story, and I was very happy to be here today, and we was really just wanting to give a bit of a overview of how we've been helping landowners to market their carbon and bring carbon projects to the market over the past 3 or 4 years. So, my first and probably most important piece of advice to any landowners thinking about this is to plan ahead and plan early. The earlier you start thinking about the potential for doing a carbon scheme on a ground, the better the result will be in general. When we're looking at, we now basically include carbon assessments into our initial feasibility studies for clients. So right at the very start, when we're looking at what is the potential for this particular piece of ground, what could the project design be like, you really need to be thinking about carbon right at those initial stages. And as Pat was mentioning earlier, that really goes into the additionality requirements for carbon, because if carbon has to be required, it has to be really part of that initial planning process to demonstrate that it really is required to make the project viable. In terms of how the application process generally works, the carbon application really works very much in tandem with how the forestry grant scheme works. So you go through a planning phase, and at the point you're ready to do your full ag grant application, you're also generally ready to do your carbon registration. And both of those things need to be completed before you can go on to the operational phase and actually deliver the projects. And once the operational phase is completed, you will submit your grant claim, and at that point you're also ready to do your validation audit for the carbon, and then your carbon units are issued. But what I would highlight in this graphic is that at the point how early carbon registration is. And carbon registration, although it's not exactly a final decision, you will have made some very important decisions about how you want to market your carbon at the point that you choose where to register your carbon. So this is why it's really important to really start thinking about carbon right in that planning phase, and make sure that you'll make some critical decisions about how your carbon is going to be marketed in that phase, and if you want to make sure you get the carbon registration correct. So one of the major decisions you need to make in terms of your carbon is who's going to be your project developer. And almost all forestry consultancy now have some sort of option in terms of a carbon marketing or access to other carbon markets, but there are also independent carbon brokers like Forest Carbon who deal purely in the carbon side of things. I'm not expecting you to read all the information here, so don't panic about this slide, but it was really just here to demonstrate that if we've been involved in the design and development of a project, we only need these couple of things at the top of the list in order to be able to do a validation for a carbon project. Whereas if we haven't been involved in the design, we need basically everything at the bottom of the list. And really, so it was just to try and make the point that whoever develops your carbon will really need to know all the details, financial, design, specifications and the application process that you went through. So it sort of does make sense to maybe have it doing the one person, but it could be two. So when we're starting to talk to a client about carbon, they generally come up with pretty much this list of questions. Is the project eligible? What are the legal responsibilities that come with a woodland carbon project? Who's going to buy it? How much money can you make? And when will that money come in? And then what are the long-term costs associated with woodland carbon in terms of long-term ongoing verification audits? And these are all very sensible questions, and unfortunately my answer is usually that depends. Because it really depends on two things essentially. It depends on how you design the scheme, and it depends on how you choose to market your carbon. So for the rest of this presentation, what I really want to do is give you an overview of different ways that people choose to market their carbon, and different ways that we've seen, and just to give you an idea of what the options are and how that might change what the answers are to some of these questions. So we generally break your selling options down into 3 main uses. So for some people, they will have another aspect to their business, maybe a farming business, a distillery, or maybe a totally unrelated business, and therefore they're generating carbon on one area of their business that they can use to offset for their own other business interests. So that's a very cost-effective way to generate carbon if you have that kind of requirement. So we have seen lots of people use it for their own internal carbon accounting. Other than that, if you're trying to actually sell the carbon directly to someone else, there's generally two main markets. There's a wholesale market and there's a purely voluntary market. And basically the choice between these basically depends largely on what your financial position is and what your financial objectives behind your sale is, and also possibly your your attitude to risk and your consideration of what you think of the market is going to do. And you can also mix and match these options to a certain extent. So lots of options. So carbon sales has certainly been getting a bit of great publicity recently. It's starting to really enter the public consciousness. The other view very much very public that big corporations are really moving into this space and making fairly significant moves in this market. But this is absolutely not the only way in which carbon can be sold. However, the wholesale market in general, it's largely about large corporations, big businesses, and they often will have a formal requirement for offsetting. So they're looking for the fully accredited woodland carbon units. They're not that interested in pending issuance units. So as you're seeing, we are now seeing the valuation of carbon very much taking place in around property sales, the buying and selling of whole estates, or buying and selling of project areas with carbon potential. It's very much part of the market currently. We've also seen interest in long-term leasing arrangements where corporate buyers might look at leasing ground for 30 or 50 years and essentially carrying all the implementation and development costs of a project in order to, in return for the carbon that's produced under the time of the lease. And some of these corporations and businesses might have relatively deep pockets. So in terms of cash flow, they could be interested, and we have seen agreements where they have made upfront payments, where they've actually paid for the development and even the feasibility studies of certain areas as part of their investment and into the development of the carbon right. And then they may also be interested in they might take on certain elements of the legal responsibilities while they're involved, and they may also be willing to pay some of the long-term management costs of carbon. The downside of that, because they're taking on such a large share of the risk, is they tend to pay at the bottom end of the carbon market price. So we're seeing wholesale prices at the moment of somewhere around 10 to 15 pounds a tonne. They're also generally working on relatively short timescales. They're generally working around net zero targets of maybe 2050, which may sound like it's a long time away, but as Pat was explaining, 30 years in the lifetime of woodland carbon crushing project is not really that long in Scotland, and therefore there's a limit to how many units you can generate within that time frame. And that means that they're generally looking at large projects which are producing tens of thousands of units, and therefore that generally equates to something roughly around 200 hectares or more. Not exclusively, of course. The voluntary market, in contrast, is generally tends to be smaller companies who may not have any actual formal requirement to offset, but they're almost exclusively interested in the positive publicity, in the story that they can tell around doing this. So obviously, large corporates are interested in that, but they also require the carbon units. With the voluntary market, they're primarily only really buying essentially something that is valuable to them in terms of the story that they can tell, the engagement that they can get out of it. They might want to use it for corporate social responsibility, something that they can share with their employees, or something that they can use to demonstrate their connections to their local environment and where they carry out their business. So they're normally looking for relatively small number of units. They're maybe looking for them over a certain number of years. They know what their footprint is, and they're wanting to offset for that for the next 3 or 5 years. With this kind of arrangement, obviously, therefore, the money comes in smaller chunks and possibly over a longer period, and less opportunity to get an upfront payment. And also, generally, the legal responsibilities and long-term costs of carbon will stay with the owner. The upside of this kind of arrangement is that you can get a premium price for high quality projects. And we are already seeing prices in excess of £30. And certainly, again, would stress the point, I think the trend tends to be upwards. So our own particular effort in this area is a product which we're very shortly going to be launching called EcoCarbon, which is essentially a brokerage platform where we're basically a platform where we can sell our clients carbon on their behalf to small companies like this who are interested in very much in that high quality end of the market. And I think the high quality end is really interesting because it's where the ideas of natural capital that Pat was talking about and carbon start to kind of intersect and produce quite interesting things. And as the carbon market is maturing, I think we're seeing a greater development of like a price differential around what were always called the additional benefits, and are now becoming really critical to identify exactly what those additional benefits are and what value does that bring to a project. Just now that there's just sufficient scale of projects, that's starting to become really important to identify what is specific about this project that makes it valuable compared to just the general value of planting trees. So we've approached our pricing strategy a little bit differently. We basically price our carbon around a long-term cost projection for the entire value of the project, and work out what is the genuine cost of producing this carbon over the project period, which could be over 100 years. And then on top of that, we create essentially an additional bonus payment, which is paid to the landowner, which is the impact value, which is essentially kind of a quantification of these natural capital or ecosystem services benefits. And as Pat's example kind of demonstrated, working out the value of natural capital is really complicated. And one reason that carbon has been the first market to really get developed in this space is because calculating carbon is easier. I won't say easy, because if you look at a carbon calculation, easy is not the word, but it is easier than trying to estimate what is the value of planting, value to biodiversity, or in terms of planting 12 species on your project as opposed to planting 4. We know that that's good. We don't know how to quantify what the value of that good is. So the way we've approached this is basically we work around a woodland charter based on these the 4 pillars. And what we've done is essentially identify actions around these pillars that the projects can develop, which go well above and beyond what is required under the UK Forest Standard or through the Forestry Grant Scheme. So this could be things like, actually funny enough, exactly what Fiona was talking about in terms of protecting ancient woodlands. So if we are looking at, extending fenced areas in order to protect ancient woodlands and give them room to regenerate, it could be things like creating new public access routes through a new woodland. It could be things like making sure you're connecting up certain key areas of habitat and providing wider and more sustainable habitat networks. It could be things like doing montane planting and using volunteers to plant rare or less common species. And what we do then is basically we score all our projects against these criteria and provide essentially a bonus payment on the basis that we can demonstrate to not only to our buyers but to the landowner that the additional benefits that they are providing through the design of the project that they're implementing. And basically the idea is that we know that people are really interested in these stories. And if you're doing all these additional actions you'll have a really powerful story to tell. And this is something that, especially in the voluntary market, people are really interested in and willing to pay for. But we need to take the time to explain to them what those benefits actually are. And it does mean that people then want to feel like they are investing, because this carbon is so intangible. When they are investing in these things, they want to know that they are having a real impact, and it's being able to quantify that and make that feel real to them is really important. So our platform is essentially trying to provide that sense of connection, but it's not just about having a platform or window and an email update service. It's essentially also about bringing people out into the woodland and encouraging them to come and visit these woodlands that they're investing in, and even having events and in these woodlands. So it's not necessarily going to be appropriate for every landowner and every project, but it's a way for us to fulfill our mission around trying to reconnect people with nature, giving them a really tangible way to invest in these projects and feel connected to that improvement in the world. So what I hope that this sort of rapid overview has given you is an idea that carbon is a very flexible funding mechanism. We've gone from sort of carbon as a very as a unit and a token and something that has to be done in formal offsetting, through to carbon as an experience and something that you can sell as a story. And there's all sort of shades of grey in between those two extremes. So my advice really would be to try and develop a compelling vision of what you can do with your land, because that will give you a really interesting story to tell. And there's lots of people who are genuinely interested in investing in that kind of thing. Because at the end of the day, carbon is just a mechanism, and without a vision of what you're trying to do with the ground, then it doesn't really go anywhere. That's me. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks, Claire. That's a really good overview. I think, well, from my point of view anyway, the three talks actually kind of link together really well, and drew out strands from the other talks really nicely there, I think. Can I ask, does anybody want to come in on a question for any of the speakers, or just on any of this in general? Or maybe just stick your hand up or post it. I'll just check the, where is the, yeah, just got the chat open now. I'll maybe ask them to kick it off actually. Oh yeah, somebody want to come in there? Yep. No. Somebody's got the microphone on, but I'm not sure if it's to ask a question or if they just turned it on. No? Okay, so there's not a question, I think. So if you're not asking a question, can I just ask you to turn your microphone off for the time being? And I just wanted to ask a fairly straightforward one, actually, and maybe come back to the biodiversity point and the additionality and things, because that's really interesting. But one is, it's a straightforward question, is that if you're taking forward at the moment a woodland scheme, forestry grant scheme, I know some people are sort of putting woodland carbon code certification onto that. Whereas some people are coming at it from the very beginning and saying, I'm doing a carbon scheme, which is sort of, you know, you're really thinking about it all the way through, as you said, Claire. Whereas some people are maybe going at it, oh, I better get certification because lots of people are doing it. Either way, how much work would you say it is in addition to a forestry grant scheme to go through the process to make sure you get woodland carbon code certification? And that's not anyone in particular. Pat might want to have a go at it, but Claire, you obviously referred to it, but anyone that wants to have a go at that.
Well, I mean, I think you do need the full suite of information, as I was saying there, that, you know, you need to know everything about the scheme. You need to know the finances, you need to know the legals. So, I mean, for us, generally, it's things like legal deeds that you wouldn't normally require for a forestry grant scheme, but you do need to be able to prove ownership for the woodland carbon code, so to a higher level. So that's something that generally comes up. And it's also things like you need information about if you're going through a financial assessment, you need to know what the finances were of the ground before you were doing the woodland carbon code. So you need to know what was the finances of that area of ground before it was converted into woodland. And that's something that can be quite difficult, because especially if you're maybe putting in 50 hectares that used to be in a large grazing area. So working out what the economics of that was and getting a budget around what that was before, it can be somewhat a little bit tricky, and it does take a little bit of time. And it's generally something that we need support from the landowners and or maybe their financial, you know, advisors to get those figures correct. So there is some additional work, but those would be the main things that I'd say that are not present in the forestry grant scheme. Almost everything else is essentially is largely covered by the forestry grant scheme.
Okay, and Pat, you were going to come in there. I think you were muted at the start.
Yeah, I was there. Yeah, just adding to what Claire said, you do need to know about the economics of the previous land use, but we're trying to simplify how we do these calculations. We've been developing a more standardized sort of spreadsheet that will make it easier for people to do this. So there is some extra work for carbon projects, perhaps especially if it's a landowner on their own for the first time. But then there is quite a wide range of organisations. Obviously, Claire's talked about Tree Story, but there's a wide range of intermediaries involved in this who will help and who have lots of experience in putting projects together, can really sort of relieve that workload, really. But as over time, we're trying to minimise the amount of additional work. But obviously we have to, the key thing about carbon markets compared to other traditional markets is that you need to provide some of this information to provide assurance to the carbon market that, you know, it's a quality project. And so there are certain things we can't shortcut for that purpose. You know, investors need to know it's not greenwashing, they're not buying hot air. And the additionality calculations is part of that. So that's why these things need to be looked at.
Yeah, it has to be real. And I just, because it's related, Fiona, could I just ask you, and you kind of said it anyway in your presentation, but there is your Future Woodland Scotland also provide funding to cover some of that stuff, don't they? The certification element, the involvement of an agent or, you know, whoever at the start.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I mean, as I said in the presentation, one of the things we're trying to do is support creation of new native woodland and try and remove the barriers to that. And one of the barriers that, you know, we have identified is the complexity of the applications. You know, that there is due diligence needed, and that's why they are complicated. So we do pay for a professional person, a forestry agent, woodland agent, to draw up these documents for the applicant. And, you know, the Woodland Carbon Code is an amazing resource. You know, well done, Pat and you and Vicky. You know, it's brilliant in terms of giving that information. But we do recognise that there are complexities in these carbon calculations. So we cover the full cost of that. We handhold, if you like, the applicant through that process.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure folk were kind of aware of that. And I've got another question there from Simon as well. And also just to mention, folks, please do, if you have a question, you're doing the webinar thing and being quiet, but if you have a question, stick your hand up or put it in the chat, please, and I'm quite happy to read them out. Simon's the $1 million question or whatever. If you're sort of looking into the future, what do you imagine the value of carbon will be in 2 or 3 years' time, and the climate change agenda is even more advanced? Pat, do you want to have a?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's a straight answer, but I think what we do know is that the prices will continue to rise. That seems pretty likely because, for a number of reasons, that, you know, climate change is going up the agenda all the time. There's more and more targets coming in, more stringent targets. Companies will come under more pressure to achieve net zero targets. There's a limit to how many projects can come through, and that will push the price up because there'll be competition. So I'd expect it to go up. I mean, if somebody had asked me what was the typical price under the Woodland Carbon Code, say 5 years ago, we might have said £5 to £10 a tonne. Whereas now we're easily saying 10 to 20, sometimes more. So upwards, I would say, but I don't have a crystal ball, and there isn't any sort of prediction. We have looked at this to try and find anybody who's done anything more sophisticated to work out where it might be going, but I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, I would agree absolutely with that. I think, yeah, like you say, carbon price has gone up. It's probably doubled in the past, like you say, 3 or 5 years. So, and certainly I think the upward trend is fairly stable for the next wee while. I do think there are potential factors around 2050 where you might think about it coming back down. I think there's, as alternative options to offsetting become more financially viable, I think the pressure to find an alternative rather than to offset will eventually start to reduce demand. But how fast that will happen is a very difficult question. So yes, I think in the short term, I think we can be fairly confident it will go up, but it is a global market and it does respond to global factors. So there are always opportunities, and there could be big decisions made at a global policy level, which could have a significant impact in the longer term.
Okay. And I've got a couple of hands raised as well, so a couple of questions. I'll go to Alex. I think, Alex, you had your hand up first. You want to come in there with a question, and I'll come back to the ones in the chat as well.
Thanks, Rob. Hi. Yeah, a question for Pat, if you don't mind. I've asked the Forestry Commission down here in England recently and didn't get much of an answer, but I'm interested in how the Woodland Carbon Code will tie in with the English woodland creation offering. The EWCO is planning to fund 100% of standard costs in certain places and more by stacking options. Would sort of landowners still be able to use the Woodland Carbon Code on a scheme like that? Because through the additionality rule, I think that would cancel out any carbon funding. Is that right? You're muted, Pat.
Thanks. I'm sorry. It will depend on the scheme, but the idea of UCO is that certain payments are optional. There are top-up payments for public benefits, basically. And if schemes attract private finance, then that would remove that eligibility for some of those top-up payments. So that's what I'd see happening with the Wood and Carbon Code, is that if people are getting private finance in for carbon credits, it will reduce the amount that UCO actually covers. That's the way it should work. But it's all very new. We actually have been working through one or two case studies to look at what UCO might mean and how we'll operate it in practice, because we'll need to be confident that the code's not being used to supplement UCO if UCO has already been not too generous, but quite generous. So, but of course, in England, it's worth bearing in mind that the economics of woodland creation are quite challenging, and that's the reason why the Woodland Carbon Guarantee was introduced in England, which is a significant payment on top of existing grant schemes. So I don't think you can say automatically that UCO means that woodland is viable. There will be lots of schemes that will still need the carbon, but it's something we're looking at quite carefully.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. And it was James, I think, also has his hand up there. James, you want to come in?
Thanks. Yeah, it was just a comment on the price of carbon. The projections are, yes, it's probably going to go up, but by how much, I guess, is going to be determined by the international market. You can still buy, you can buy carbon today at $5 a unit. So why companies would be spending £60, £70, whatever the projections are, is pretty optimistic. I was also going to make a point on yields. We touched on this earlier. I think you go into these schemes with your eyes wide open, as Claire says, and the accuracy of what you're doing needs to be absolutely fundamental. We had occasion to look at a scheme up in the northwest of Scotland. It was over 100 hectares of W4, so predominantly birch type woodland. And just as a modelling exercise, we reduced the yield class from 6 to 4 over the site, and it dropped the carbon yield over 1 hectare from 340 tonnes per hectare to 190. So you can imagine that multiplied over 100, and then you're in the position of selling that on to somebody. You're selling a promise, and you need to make sure that promise is absolutely right.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think the thing to remember, of course, with that as well, James, is that projects need to do their due diligence properly, and make honest assessments of the sites and look at the risks. And all projects are supposed to do risk assessments. Obviously, the margins of error are, as I mentioned earlier, quite substantial, because we take 20% off the estimates, and then further 20% goes into the buffer. So there is quite some protection there. But it's certainly, the landowners don't want to be exposing themselves to undue risks. But one way to do that is to make sure they have proper assessments of their sites and use realistic yield classes.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll go to, well, actually, I'll make just one point on that, because we made this point about biodiversity and additionality. And I think, Claire, from your talk at the end there, it's quite evident as well from what you were saying that you will get a better price per tonne from some companies if you market a scheme which has additional benefits like biodiversity or whatever. And also in a more formal sense, policy-wise, we might even be moving towards a place where you start actually to get money for biodiversity credits or whatever. And at the moment, it seems that can be quite important in terms of your per tonne figure that you're getting. Is that right? And where do you see that kind of getting better in the future from what you're saying? I guess that's for everybody.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think, like I was saying, as the carbon market is maturing, there's starting to be a bit of a differential about what that carbon actually is. And I think as companies are looking in more detail about what the projects they're investing in are, they are starting to ask a lot of important questions about what does that actually mean? And therefore we are starting to see the real focus on what is this project actually delivering. And also I think because there's been so much publicity recently around greenwashing, people are really conscious that they really need to understand what it is they're investing in. And I think particularly at the lower, at the where they're not really actually requiring the carbon units, their primary focus is on what is the story that I can tell about this woodland, and what is the connection that I can demonstrate to this particular project. And therefore, it's very much, they're not, in some ways, they're not really buying carbon. What they're buying is that opportunity to invest. And the better story you can tell that around why this project is something that deserves investment, the more likely they are to be thinking about parting with £30 a tonne. You know, so yes, it's I agree with the previous comment someone made that, you know, I think corporates will always look at the global market, and possibly you're always going to be at the lower end of what they're going to be willing to pay. There is a kudos to them if we're buying in Scotland or buying in the UK. So I think they'll always want to have some element of UK carbon, but they might not want to pay the top prices. But for a local company to invest in a project that is happening in their backyard, and be able to take their staff out and say, this is the woodland we're helping to build together, they are willing to pay more, and that won't necessarily be so strictly tied to the global market price.
Can I just add as well, I think on James's earlier point about, you know, availability of cheap credits in other countries, that's true. That there are some risks though around that, which companies are quite aware of, which Claire is alluding to. That companies will largely want to buy good quality credits that the market respects, and therefore it strengthens any net zero claims they might make. What they don't want to do is end up buying cheap credits where the schemes involved have been undermined, or the additionality is questionable, and that has happened a lot in the past. But I mean, that's one of the reasons why Mark Carney's task force has been launched, the international task force, in the last few months. It's all about bolstering future confidence in carbon markets, because there are some real issues that need to be addressed. What we're trying to do with schemes like the Woodland Carbon Code is be at the quality end of the market as much as we can.
It's just something, Robert, I was just thinking about listening to that, is worth adding, and I'm sure, Pat, you've been thinking about this quite a bit as well, is that there is a cost to the land, ongoing cost to the land manager of verification. So we talk a lot about how much the carbon can bring in, but land managers need to be very aware of their ongoing commitment every 10 years to verifying that carbon, and the costs of that are not fully worked out yet. I know, Pat, that you and Vicky are looking at how to simplify the verification, as you said, with remote sensing. But at the moment, if you've got a large scheme, there's quite a lot of actual on the ground plot monitoring that needs to be done, and that can be costly.
Okay.
Yes, it can, and as you say, Fiona, people need to factor that in. Some of the intermediaries are trying to do this as well, to actually sort of make that part of their offer to put money aside to cover those costs. So it is, but ongoing verification monitoring is really important as well for confidence in the market. But hopefully over time, the remote sensing techniques and everything will reduce those costs. I mean, where we set out fairly high costs going decades into the future, I think that's probably unlikely, because I'll be fairly confident that techniques will come in to deal with that.
Okay. A few more questions there in the chat. One from Colin for Claire. Very interesting to hear about tree store. Is there a minimum area threshold for network contributors? Just thinking about a Maiwaki style forest in particular, which may be community based. Is there a minimum area threshold for network contributors?
We don't really have a minimum. What we do, as Fiona was saying, for small schemes, it is much easier to group projects together. So we basically have some portfolios which will group smaller woodlands together, again, for the economies of scale that brings. Realistically, usually about 3 hectares is kind of the small scale. You get a bit below that, and it just, the cost of actually the cost associated with the verification, the validation, just essentially wipes out the income that you would get from that kind of project. So generally, about 3 hectares is kind of the minimum. But yes, we don't have any sort of minimum size for projects.
Okay. And a question from Malcolm as well. Is the biosphere big enough to handle all the offset needs? Yeah, which I guess in a UK context even is an interesting question, is there enough space? Is there enough people willing to plant trees? Is there enough space or whatever in the UK or globally to offset what we need to offset? Are we, yeah, does anyone want to take a shot at that? It's a big question.
It is a good question. And yeah, the UK is a small, crowded island, lots of demand on its land for different purposes. So there will be a limit. I think the other thing about this, though, is that we shouldn't see offsetting as the, silver spoon for everything. There should be a mitigation hierarchy. Firms need to be reducing their emissions first, as much as possible. So, and that's important for confidence in the market as well. Otherwise, offsetting is seen as a license to pollute, really. So that it's worth having that perspective about it. I think looking into the long term, there will be residual emissions which can never be reduced to zero, and that's where offsetting will have a permanent role going beyond 2050. Even more so if you're looking to a world that's going to become carbon positive. But yeah, one to think about biosphere.
Yeah, nobody else wants to tackle that one. And it's a slight step away because we're talking about marketing carbon, obviously, and it's the same thing, I suppose. But I know some people are certifying their carbon partly as a kind of an insurance policy, maybe against offsetting their own emissions in the future. They're not sure what's going to happen with, if you're a farmer, what's going to happen with the next payment scheme or not a payment scheme or whatever, payment for ecosystem services and what have you. Are you finding that, there's this, I guess a lot of what you're dealing with is woodland schemes, but in general, are people sometimes keeping the carbon for themselves? And what you're finding is there an increasing level of interest in that? And Fiona, I know that you're Future Woodland Scotland are kind of looking at that aspect. Do we want to talk about that a little bit or comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're fairly early on in our fund, but certainly the feedback that we're getting both from land managers and also from agents is that everyone's kind of hedging their bets at the moment. They're really not sure which way it's going. We haven't had the announcement on the new rural payment scheme, whatever form that's going to take. It's quite likely, isn't it, that carbon reduction is going to be some kind of cross compliance. I suspect it's going to be in there somewhere. And certainly from the land managers I've talked to, they say, well, look, let me just get it in the bank, as it were, and I'm just going to hang on to it. And I'm going to see what happens, because of course they don't need to sell it now. They can just keep it there, and it can be going up in price. It's almost like an investment. But I think for us, and this sort of goes back to the last question a little bit, is that we're really interested in looking at behavioural change, in terms of increasing the amount of native woodland in Scotland. And the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group, I know that work's a little bit old now, but it really looked at the potential. It really highlighted potential for woodland on lower grade agricultural land. Also, the farmers, it's in the hands of the farmers, a lot of this potential. And, that's one of the challenges for us, is how do we reach them? So that's why our pilot is really about testing approaches. What are the triggers that are needed for behavioural change to turn that bit of rough grazing into woodland? That's the bit we're interested in. And it may be that the stick with cross compliance is a little bit more weighty than the carbon carrot, but who knows? We're all just watching that space, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, I would say much the same. We're getting increasing number of clients who are wanting to hedge their bets, and that's why I was saying in some ways it's quite good that because the carbon market is so flexible, it gives you options. So we're finding a lot of people wanting to maybe sell some up front to generate some income to allow for the cash flow, and sit on some, so that if the carbon price does go up to £60 a tonne, they can cash in on that. So and that comes, like I was saying, comes down to in part about attitudes to risk and what individual landowners think the carbon market is going to do. But it does have a flexibility to allow people to experiment and to play with both those options.
Is the message there almost that you know, if you're doing a woodland scheme now, if it is eligible or if it's likely to be eligible, that you might be missing a trick by not getting certification. Is that overstating it, or would that be, you know, from your point of view, would that be a fair enough kind of conclusion? Or
I certainly think it would be. It almost seem a little bit professionally suspect not to have mentioned it to someone if they had an eligible scheme and you hadn't sort of mentioned it to them, because it is a significant potential income source, and it can and as Fiona says, we're very interested in the way it changes behaviour, and like I was talking about, how it impacts on the design. Because if you're thinking about carbon right from the beginning, you might design the scheme slightly different in order to achieve a better carbon price, because you've done something like put a path in, or because you made the fence line slightly differently. So it's trying to capture that right from the beginning and design the best possible scheme and get the best possible carbon price out at the end of it. So I think, yeah, it is something that it should be part of that conversation.
Okay. I have a few hands raised, and I think Malcolm was first. I'm not certain, but forgive me if Malcolm wasn't first. But we'll go to Malcolm first anyway. Malcolm, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to answer the question of why farmers are hesitant with their marginal land. I mean, a lot of my marginal land is very important for quite high densities of waders like curlews and lapwings. Forestry, we've got a carbon code for forestry, we've got a carbon code for peatland. We haven't yet got a carbon code for permanent grassland, where there's already a very high biodiversity interest. And my worry is we wind up in this mad rush, you know, similar to the Lawson tax changes in the 1980s, when a lot of heather moorland got covered in sickle spruce. In my mind, complete disaster environmentally. I mean, that's the worry I think a lot of farmers have. You mentioned marginal farmland. Well, most of Scotland is marginal farmland, but you know, what is the future agricultural payment scheme going to do? And are we in danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater because we've basically destroyed existing biodiversity to superimpose on it another one that happens to have a carbon payment attached? So I think there are quite big issues for farmers here, and this might not be the right forum to discuss it because most people here will be foresters, but I think it is a very important consideration for a lot of landowners going forward.
Just respond quickly. I think no, it is really important to think about the implications of land use change, and there will be significant land use change that's required to meet climate change targets. But we are, of course, in a quite different situation to the 1980s in terms of the rules and regulations that apply to forestry. So I don't think you're going to have a repeat of that. Well, it simply wouldn't happen. The UK forestry standard is in place, and the idea of extensive planting on peatlands is not going to happen. I think the experience to date, one of the things we are looking at with the code is doing a review actually of what it's achieved to date and the types of woodlands that it's supported, because by and large they've been mixed native woodlands. But we'll continue to monitor the types of woodlands that are planted. But certainly, as I said earlier, it's the woodlands that deliver wider benefits. That's our selling point, as opposed to just purely carbon, which people could buy on other bits of the market.
Okay. Did anyone else want to comment on that one? And thank you Malcolm for the question. Sorry, I didn't say that. Did anyone else want to comment on that? No.
Yeah. Rob, just coming on that quick. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what's just been said there, and I think this is a really interesting area of debate in terms of how we value different habitats. I mean, certainly as part of the due diligence process for what we do, and also for the forestry grant scheme, if there was a wetland or a breeding wader habitat, that would be a higher priority than woodland creation. You know, so there are, if it gives any reassurance, there are checks built into the system of designing schemes like this, and this is why it is quite a complex process. But there is a big debate out there, you know, and that piece of work was done, I don't know, quite how long ago, 10 years ago. The Woodland Expansion Advisory Group was a government commissioned report. I mean, it would be interesting to see if now is the time to look at renewing that and seeing exactly where the land use change balance could occur. But just to give a little bit of comfort there is a lot of checks and balances built in around habitat protection.
Thanks, Fiona. There's a couple of
sorry, I could just
yeah,
jump in
okay.
quickly. So just, I think it comes back to taking that wider perspective, wider than just carbon and wider than just forestry. I think it's trying to say that what we're wanting to sell here is an environmental good, and that might be keeping the grassland, it might be planting the trees. So I think the wider the perspective you can give, and the more thinking about what you're selling as an environmental positive, and no matter how that comes about, that's still a good story. That's still something that people value, and therefore there's something there that can be sold, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the physical carbon in trees.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that carbon, this idea that carbon is part of a bigger picture of ecosystem, I think is pretty important. And we have a couple of other hands raised there, so I'll go to Matt first and then Simon. Matt, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, it's just you quoted some figures for the income that you could get from, per hectare, and I was just wondering, like, how you get paid. Is it like a one-off payment, or do you get paid yearly, or how does it work?
So it varies a bit, really, but I'll let Fiona answer in relation to Future Woodland Scotland, and then maybe Claire or Pat can come in on how it works more broadly, I suppose. Fiona.
Okay, Matt. So with our Future Woodlands Fund officer, there are two choices. You can have a guaranteed income, and that would be £175 a hectare for 20 years, and that would be paid every year on a claim. And then the carbon ownership offer, that is where the land manager would retain the carbon, and then they would go to, there's various, as Claire's mentioned, and I think Pat's mentioned as well, there are various people out there, intermediaries, who would sell that on your behalf, and depending, I think using Claire's word, that would depend, basically on what offer was made. But one of the reasons that we're going to keep the guaranteed income in our offer is because we think there are just going to be some people out there who want that security, and don't want to be dipping into the carbon market. But as I said, this is a pilot, so we want to see what people say about that. But that's what we have at the moment.
Thanks, Fiona. So a bit in model terms, a bit like the farm woodland premium a little bit, but I'll let someone else come in.
I think there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of flexibility for this farmers. Some of them do sell all the carbon rights up front as a lump sum. Others will sell half of it or a quarter of it as a lump sum, hold on to the rest and sell it over time, perhaps as the units become verified. And others could hold on to all of it and decide to sell it over time. So, I think it's a business decision really for the farmer concerned.
Yeah. So you can get quite a lot of money up front, or you can spread it right across, depending on who you're with and how you're doing it, I suppose. And Simon, do you have another question there, or was that an old hand? I think it's a new hand, isn't it?
I've got two questions, if I may. My first one is so let's assume we've planted a new native block and we've sold the carbon credits, and we're in I don't quite understand the length of the contract, but whether it's 50 years or 100 years, what happens at the end of the contract?
Yeah, this is a good question. We have looked at this a bit. They couldn't sell any more carbon credits because that bit of land will be recorded as having had a woodland carbon project. So, but once you're out of contract, of course, then the landowner won't have any liability, to supply carbon credits to the buyer. And we have wondered, is it possible then that a landowner might apply to fell woodland, for example? On balance, initially we thought that was a pretty low risk because most of these woodlands are mixed native woodlands. They're not sort of Sitka spruce woodlands waiting to be felled. Yeah. And any woodland does look like that, people will know that from the start, and the clear fell cap will be applied to the amount of carbon they can claim. So I think that limits the risk. But having said that, it is something we've been looking at, whether we can use the UK forestry standard or something to provide more confidence that future change in management wouldn't happen, and therefore we could deny a felling license, for example. But there's still a bit of future work to do on that. So
it's a one-way journey with only one
yes
option, one point at which you can realise value.
That's right, because permanence is such an important issue. So obviously we rely on forestry legislation that it's a permanent change in land use. But one of the features, as I said earlier, of a good quality carbon standard is having permanence in credits. And nature-based solutions are susceptible to accusations of having reversals. So we want to prevent that as much as possible.
Thank you. Can I ask my second question?
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Absolutely, you can go for it. Yeah.
Thank you. So it's following on a bit from the question that Malcolm asked earlier. So I'm on the west of Scotland, and topographically speaking, it's quite difficult to carve out bits of ground that let's say you would put down, you would plant under a native program and sell the carbon units, because topographically it's quite difficult to do that. So let's assume that you've got a chunk of land that if you're going to change the land use, take stock off, you're going to end up with land that both is quite high elevations with peat on it. You've got land at lower elevations where you could plant it, and then you've got some ground where this new phrase that I've learned today, Fiona, ghost woodland. So what do you do when you end up with a chunk of ground which has got all sorts of different carbon applications, which are in different codes? How do you deal with that?
I'm not quite sure what you want me to say about that, Simon. But obviously, if you've got a wooden carbon code project, then there is an obligation attached to that land in the form of a contract. So people, need to bear that in mind. If you've got areas of peatland, then obviously they won't be eligible. You can't plant in deep peat for woodlands, but obviously they might be eligible for restoration under the peatland code. Yes, it puts some obligations on the landowner, and there is work going on. But lawyers are looking at this for various intermediaries as well, in terms of having suitable contracts in place to provide assurance in case there's a change of land ownership, for example. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Sort of, but you might end up with a chunk of land where you're trying to run parallel races. One is the woodland carbon code, one is the peatland carbon code, another one is the however the funding for ghostland woodland works, or natural regeneration. And I was just wondering if there's a process in place already that helps you pursue all three at once, or do you have to run three races separately?
No, at the moment it's well, if ghost woodlands came under the scope of the code, that would reduce it to two races. But yes, they are separate at the moment. Right. We have looked at whether we could have a joint woodland peatland project. We haven't had one yet, but even if that did happen, obviously the land would have to be separate. You can't have both on one bit of land, obviously. So at the moment, yes, it is separate races.
Right.
And although we do share the same carbon registry now with the peatland code.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I could add it to that. Unfortunately, the way the forestry grant scheme works, that the what we're looking at with the ghost woodlands would come under the woodland improvement grant. And then woodland creation is under the woodland creation option. They're different options, so they are actually separate applications. The only good news about that is if you were applying to us, we would fund both of them. But yeah, at the moment they would need to be parallel applications to Scottish Forestry, and I assume, Pat, they would be parallel project design documents.
Okay, thanks for that. Hopefully that answers the questions. There's a few other things in the chat as well. James just saying, just to maintain a balance, it would be remiss of me not to say Woodland Trust also has a carbon offer. It's a good plug. Fair enough. And Craig also said, Claire, you mentioned about the potential local markets for carbon, like local companies investing in local woodlands. Are there any examples of that regionally or at local level in Scotland that you're aware of?
So that's something we're really very much in the process of building right now, and something we were hoping. But we have kind of a base at the moment around Edinburgh because that's where our office is, and so we have a suite of companies around there, and we have quite a number of clients in East Lothian. So we have some natural connections which we're already developing, and it's something that we're going to actively pursue under our marketing strategy, essentially. But it's not. I don't have. I have some. I'm slightly restricted in what I can say because everything's not launched yet. But yeah, we don't have. I don't have any specific examples I can share with you right now.
Okay, things are in the pipeline, I guess. Then, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough. Yeah, go on.
So great. I'll put some a link to case studies in the chat, but under the code you can see them there now. But there's a case study tab at the top. But the project I mentioned earlier in Wales was an example. Actually, that was a local company planting a woodland, and there are plenty of examples of that. I think a lot of companies have said to us they would rather do something on their back door, basically, and if it can involve communities and promote their reputations and stuff, all the better, rather than purchasing credits from some other part of the world.
Okay, thanks for that. A couple of other questions there. One from Abby first. Just a slight tangent on the carbon discussion, but related, I think, in terms of the sort of interest in woodland creation generally. Do you anticipate problems in rollout due to potential lack of woodland creation and forestry skills? And do you think there are opportunities for engaging private finance in supporting rural skills training that will help get these trees planted before 2050? A good question, I think, yeah. Does anybody want to try to take a shot at that one?
I can kind of jump in on that one if you want. I mean, I think like every forestry company, we are certainly experiencing shortages of labour and difficulty of access to contractors. So certainly, I think that is something that will play out in the short term. But again, I think it comes down to this planning ahead early, if at all possible, because if you can give us 2 years to design and plan our project, then we've got a much greater chance of getting everything lined up and getting it all to work. I mean, I think, but on a more strategic level and on a more long-term level, I think we have to all be supportive of anything that's bringing new people into the industry and giving them the skills to actually to be able to do all this work. And I think it's really great to see such a pipeline of positivity of work coming through. And I think it's really an obligation on us to make sure we're encouraging the next generation to really come through and take these jobs and be able to fill this requirement, because it would be a great shame to lose this opportunity just because we physically don't have the people to actually deliver it.
It's worth saying we spend a fair bit of our time trying to upskill colleagues and stakeholders in the Woodland Carbon Code. It's a really good question. There's quite a lot to grapple with carbon markets alone, and we do need more skills and knowledge in the sector. So it is a potential break actually on carbon markets if that's not addressed. Yes, it's an ongoing challenge.
And I like this one as well. What if disease, ash dieback or something similar, lots of them, or fire destroys your woodland 20 years down the line? What happens to the credits you've sold?
I think the first thing to say on that is that you'll see projects planting now, they won't plant ash. I mean, they need to do risk assessments at the beginning. And if there's a particular risk from a particular species, then don't plant it. In their disease risk assessment, they will identify what risk is and then say what mitigation action is to reduce it. So, but if having said that, something does happen to woodland 20 years down the line, that's what the buffer is there for, to protect any verified credits. So it doesn't protect pending issuance units. So if something happens to the woodland in the very early years, that would be a risk to whoever is in charge of the woodland at that point, or it depends how the contract is set up between the buyer and the seller as to where the risk may lie. Insurance, of course, is an option. And the sector is looking at these various intermediaries involved are looking at all these different options at the moment because they are aware of these risks. But the buffer's there to protect future verified credits.
Okay.
There are rules about repaying the buffer, etc. But I'll stop there.
Right. Yeah. And in general, yeah, if you get to that point with verified, then And if you have insurance, as you say, insurance is important to us, then you should be okay. Oh, another one from Robbie here. Do you have a time scale, and I'll just check to see if there's any hands up in a minute as well. Do you have a time scale that you think the trading option may be set up, Pat? I'm aware that there are currently middlemen making 100% profits. Will this fix this?
Yeah, I don't have a timescale for when a trading option will be set up, but I mean, the more people that come into the market, the more competition, and that's a good thing. And I guess some early movers have done, set up quite good market positions, but that is changing over time, and I think that's part of I'd see that as the evolution of the market, really. So even without a trading platform, I think that there will be more middlemen becoming involved, and that will tighten things a bit.
Yeah.
So it's a good question.
Yeah, it's certainly a much more diverse marketplace now, isn't it? Or it seems to be a much more diverse marketplace. You should shop around. I had one, because we're nearly finished, so I'll just ask this one final question. If you are taking forward a woodland scheme, and you're interested in carbon, what do you think should be the first port of call? I think a lot of the time it probably is the agent, because that's who you're dealing with when it comes to, most land managers and owners, I think, deal with agents. But does anyone else have a comment on that in terms of first port of call, where you to find out more, to figure out how to do it, etc.? Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, we have links on our website. I'll put the link in the chat if you want to. There's a whole list of intermediaries. We don't necessarily want them all coming to my small team. We try to deal with the either problem cases or the developmental work. So the other option, of course, are the conservancies in Scotland, the woodland officers, both Scotland, England, and Wales. But sorry, I'll let the others chip in.
Should I just come in next? I mean, all I would say with Future Woodland Scotland, we are, this is a pilot scheme. It is limited. It will be first come, first served. And when we reach our limit for finance, we may well look for more finance. But we're not, we're quite a small player, I guess. But what we are trying to do is look at what's needed for rollout. So very much, we're very much our charitable purpose is about creating and conserving new native woodlands. So although we're quite small, we really want to get feedback, because we think that could maybe lever in more funding. But it's very much about collaborative working, and there's such a lot out there at the moment. And as James has mentioned, the Woodland Trust has got a great offer as well.
Claire, I'll give the last word to you there if you want to.
Yeah, sorry, difficult question for me to try and answer, but obviously approach your agent. But I would also, one project that hasn't been mentioned so far is Northwoods, which is also starting to develop a bit of a carbon connection as well. So there's a number of different projects out there that are trying to help people developing smaller schemes. So always be, definitely ask for advice. And yeah, your conservancies are very good source of information, because they'll know what locally might apply for you. And the other, just a final shout to say, the Woodland Carbon Code website is fantastic. And there's a lot of really useful information on there. It takes a lot of time to get your head into, but if you really want to get into the detail, there's no better source. So yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Okay. Right, well, I said this was 1 to 6, so I'll wrap it up. And I just want to say a massive thank you to our 3 speakers. It's normally be a round of applause now, but obviously we can't do virtual round of applause. But just, really thank you, because I think that was a really worthwhile and useful discussion, and I really enjoyed it. And also just to say, there's been quite a lot of information posted in the chat, so I will collate some of that and I'll send out an email to folk after this. This session is also being recorded, so I'll make sure you get a link to the recording as well. It will go up on the Safari website where the original ad for the workshops was. So I will post out a bit more information to everyone that joined us today. And just to say thank you to all of you guys as well for actually coming and joining us and participating in the workshop. So I'll stop there, let everybody go for their dinner, and say good night and thanks very much, folks. Okay. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye.